realistic expectations for Tennessee football. Kind of what are they for you? And we can kind of go around the room a little bit, but Matt, we'll start with you. Tennessee coming off a 10-win season in the regular season. Got an 11th win in the New Year's Six Bowl game, defeating Clemson in the Orange Bowl. You lose a lot of firepower, but still return an awful lot. What's realistic expectation for Tennessee this football season?
Well, I think we touched on this a little bit, and I think a lot of it comes down to Joe Milton, keeping Joe Milton upright. What does tackle play look like? You've got some questions to answer there. And again, do you win the ones you're supposed to? I think Texas A&M's a big swing game for the Vols. You still have to go on the road to Florida early in the season and prove that you can win there. So there's some question marks out there. I mean, I think Rob shot it around 9 to 10, last week on the Mailbag podcast. For me, I think it's probably 9 right now going in. I want to see some more questions answered during fall camp. I won't say that 10's out of the realm of possibility, but I think 9's probably the safe number to be at right now as we learn a little bit more about this football team in the next 2 months.
For me, I'm working on position previews that get started on Monday, and so I've been diving into those and looking at things, and I did some preview stuff and some spring recap stuff as well. So I've looked at a lot of different numbers, and I think sometimes stats are overblown, as we all know. But there's a couple things that stand out to me, Grant, when I look at this team. One, and this is not a stat, but one, how in the world do they handle expectations? When really they were, it's been a honeymoon, right? There was no expectations in year one. Year two, you thought they would be better, but they certainly exceeded anybody's expectations with a win over Alabama and obviously beating Florida. Now they are perceived to be or have arrived, and a lot of people are calling them contenders, and they're saying this and saying that about them. So how does this locker room handle expectations? That's one. And two, for me, what is the offense? How do they adapt to Joe Milton's game? Because it's not Hendon Hooker's game. And Hendon bailed him out of so many issues so many times with his legs. I'm not saying Joe can't, but I don't know that Joe can do – I don't think Joe can do what Hendon could do with legs. So how many gotcha plays does Joe Milton fix like Hendon did a year ago? Those are my two big picture questions when you don't talk about specific positions and, kind of diving into the tackle spot and all these other things. Those are my two biggest things that jump out to me right now.
I thought last year once expectations kind of started to build, I thought they handled it pretty well in terms of they kind of kept going after beating Florida at home the way they did to do what they did against Alabama. Obviously, you go to Georgia, that's a pretty good football team. They don't play too well in Athens, and you lose that game, and obviously you fall on your face at South Carolina. But to answer the way they did after the disaster that was South Carolina and to beat Vanderbilt, a bad Vanderbilt team, 56-0, but to beat that team the way they did, and then to beat Clemson the way they did and show up the way they did in the Orange Bowl. So expectation-wise, I thought that was kind of steps forward. But I think when we talked about this probably back in the spring, my expectation was don't expect it to be 2022 every single year and 11 wins be the floor. Maybe that's what it is moving forward down the road a little bit, but right now it still feels like I kind of agree with Rob. You can go down the schedule and, they could lose to A&M, they could lose to Alabama, they could lose to Georgia, and you still have 9 winnable games on the schedule. I think it all just kind of circles back to, and this is something Austin's talked about, you look at Florida and you might not think that Florida's in the best spot, and Phil Steele put out his top 40 preseason. Florida, I don't think, was in that top 40. So nobody's really expecting anything out of the Gators. But you still got to go to Gainesville, and you still got to prove that you can win down there, a place that Tennessee hasn't won in however many years and, X number of times over the last, few decades, whatever that number is. So you got to go down there and kind of, I think, set the tone early for what kind of season it's going to be. Because if you go down there and trip up on that one, then I'm not exactly sure what's next. I don't think UTSA is a game to sleep on. Obviously, South Carolina. Tennessee should be motivated and ready for that one. But I think it goes back to Florida, September 16th, and kind of how they go from there. And I agree with there's a ton of questions when you go across the position groups. Quarterback, you don't know what Joe's going to be until you consistently see it. And you don't know what this offensive line is going to be until you see the 5 that are out there and how they play. And I think that goes for a lot of different position groups on both sides of the ball. So for right now, they should win a lot of ball games. I don't think it's going to be 2022. But there's still a ton of unanswered questions that make you wonder about this team.
Well, here's the other thing, too, Go ahead, Matt.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, it doesn't feel, similar in a lot of ways to last year in terms of how the schedule shapes up. But I think you circle that Florida game every year. But as far as a game that, I won't say make or break, but kind of is a pivot point right there in week 4, it's just so big. It was so big last year. You had to win that game. And, this year, again, you've got to get that monkey off your back in the swamp. I mean, feels like when you look at the series history between those two, these past 2 games are as big as any on the Tennessee side of it right now, at least.
Yeah, and listen, nobody's sleeping on Kentucky either, because I know that there's a couple of posters who are pretty adamant that Kentucky's a bigger challenge this year than Florida is for Tennessee. I'm not buying that, because I do count the history, and I do remember that Tennessee was in control of that game last year, and Florida's throwing in the end zone on the last play of the game. So there's a monkey to get off your back, much the same way Kentucky's trying to get a monkey off their back about Tennessee, because they have lost that game seemingly every way possible for forever, with the exception of a couple of bizarre games, that head scratchers. Tennessee's had their number in every way. But coming off of Alabama, going to Kentucky is not going to be an easy task. There's no doubt about that. That will be a game that is a challenge. I mean, it'll probably be a night game up there. It'll be cold, and you know how that'll go. So I don't think anybody's sleeping on that game. But for me, it's the Florida game, because it is the tone setter that you guys were talking about. Here's the other thing, too. And this is just, you can't control this. And I know Tennessee had a critical injury last year with Cedric Tillman that they were able to overcome. What they haven't had, Grant, is they haven't had critical injuries in the line of scrimmage when you look at it. I mean, Tennessee has 85 starts returning on the offensive line. If you count John Campbell's starts but then you look at what Jerome Carvin and Darnell Wright had. They had 80 starts among the 2 of them at Tennessee. Both of them played right at 2,000 snaps in their career, and played every snap last year. Wright did, and Carvin had 43 career starts. So, you've been pretty fortunate, Grant, that you haven't had that injury bug, and you've been able to see what one major injury to do. Now, they overcame the Hendon Hooker injury the last 2 games of the season. Bad Vanderbilt team helped. They were able to overcome Cedric Tillman because of Ramel Keaton. But what happens if they do have an injury on the offensive line? Because there's nobody behind those guys in the depth chart that's lined up and played in this league for any significant amount of time.
No, and you have to be encouraged with what they've done at the skill positions when you have those guys get hurt and somebody steps up. And, yeah, it's a different story in the trenches on both sides of the ball, on the offensive line especially. I've thought during the first 2 years of the Heupel that obviously Darnell Wright being picked where he is, he's a really good football player, and he was picked there for a reason, and he proved it. He earned it, whatever, he got there. But it feels like you never really had to worry about that offensive line, regardless of who the 5 were that out there. If they had to mix and match at times, if they didn't have the same guys out there every single time, it felt like they were going to get something done just because of the way this offense moves, the quickness it goes with, the way they run the ball, the way they spread the wide receivers out. The kind of the design of the offense almost supports that offensive line a little bit more. Now you're talking about that's one of the unanswered questions. One of the many is, what are your best 5 offensive linemen, and what do they look like, and what combination? And if you don't have anybody behind them, obviously, one critical injury there, and that could derail you. But I think you have to be encouraged by what you've seen from this coaching staff in the past based on the offensive production, including the offensive line, that even if there is an injury there, you think this offense could keep going because of the design and the speed with which it moves, I guess.
I was going to be my next question, and Grant, you kind of dove into it a little bit. It's almost like having blind faith in Josh Heupel in this offense. You never want to have blind faith, because that's when you can get in trouble. But if you go back and look at his stats as a play caller in this league, as a head coach for 5 years, I mean, he's had top 10 offense. He's had a number of different quarterbacks, and Joe Milton will be another different type of quarterback that he's had. But the run game's still been there, and the offense has still been explosive. So when I think of kind of from a broader perspective, Brent, when I think of expectations for Tennessee, I mean, I don't think Tennessee's going to have the number 1 offense in the country, but I still kind of think it's going to be up there. And if you're going to be scoring points, 37, 39, 40 points a game, and your defense takes a step to where we think it's going to because you're deeper in some spots, I mean, there's no reason for me not to think that the expectation should be kind of where you were last year. But if you finish with 9 regular season wins, it's not the end of the world. That's not a bad season. At least that's how I view it.
Well, and I think you're exactly right when it comes to, and I don't think it's wrong to assume this, the belief that the offense is going to be explosive and are going to do things. I mean, Josh Heupel's offense scored 30 or more points 12 times last year. I mean, I know go back and look the year before that they did it, I think 9 or 10 times. I mean, everywhere he's been, they've scored points. And so when the belief is that they're going to score points, then it's, can you make just a handful of plays on defense, Grant? I mean, it's not like you've got to come in and say, okay, we got to win this game 10-9. You got to hold this team to 9 points to have a chance to win. Nobody's going to the ball yard thinking that, because this offense has been so good for so long everywhere Josh Heupel's been. That creates and enhances the expectations when you look at the schedule. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that anybody's going to predict Tennessee to win less than 9 games this year. I mean, that feels like 9's almost the floor. Now, that's kind of crazy to say, but that's kind of what it feels like when you look at the offensive numbers that they put up in 2 years in this system.
I think in the past there have been expectations around the Tennessee football program, and they've failed miserably in some of those seasons. But I think what's different this time is, how long has it been since Tennessee was coming off an 11-win season? 22 years, right? Since 2001. It was the last time they were number 1 in any kind of ranking of, 25 years ago, whatever it was. When was the last time they were talking about coming off a win over Alabama at home, or coming off a win against Florida, or whatever? I mean, just to start the season the way they did last year, to surprise everybody, to keep going the way they did, to have a Heisman front runner at quarterback, to even, like Brent talked about 2 years ago. I mean, they scored 28 points in the first quarter twice in 2021, if I remember correctly, at Missouri, and against South Carolina. They put 62 up at Missouri. They hammered South Carolina at home with a very depleted roster that Heupel inherited in year 1. So I think it feels a little bit different when you talk about expectations, because internally there has to be a different sense of confidence with this group, because they've seen it happen. It happened on the field. Like, there's not a lot of Tennessee teams that can lean on the stuff that this team can lean on from last season. And no, it's not the same exact team. You lost a lot of important players, but it's the same coaching staff, and it's the same guy calling the plays that you've seen put up a ton of points. And like Brent said, just make a handful of stops. So I don't know, Matt, if you have anything on that. Like, just, it feels different internally. You would think internally there's going to be a different confidence, because this team's proven it, or at least a lot of these guys on this roster have proven it based on what they've done the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Grant. I mean, I think when you look at it, to me, 2 guys that I think have hit off really well on this team are both from a similar area geographically in the country, and that's Ramel Keaton and Caleb Webb. Ramel Keaton was the most overshadowed guy on this roster heading into last fall, but man, was he huge, and we've talked about that a lot. Tennessee return, they lose Jalen Hyatt, they lose Cedric Tillman, but they return some talent at that receivers position. Brew McCoy back, Ramel Keaton back, ceiling appears really high for Dante Thornton and Squirrel Watt. But again, like to Brent's point about injuries earlier, who's that guy that's Ramel Keaton this year? It could be Caleb Webb, it could be Chaz Nimrod. You've got to answer some of those questions. But, I think what some of these older guys that are back have, now experienced some of this. It's leading the younger guys in a good direction. And those things translate. You talk about a handful of stops each game. That's what Tennessee needed a lot of times last year. When they got them early and they were able to have offensive success, they started to roll a little bit. Again, I think, for Tennessee, they got off the field a lot when it mattered last year. They couldn't get off the field. I mean, you couldn't help them off the field against South Carolina at times. They walked into a buzzsaw that night, but they got off the field at times against Georgia when they needed to. So, again, get off the field, score points. You have to believe, I think, that you have a chance to win ball games. And I think that's the biggest difference for this team under Josh Heupel, is that they know that they're going to score points and they're going to have a chance to win ball games.
Yeah, it's interesting. Two things, Eric. I said earlier, not all stats are important, but I keep throwing stats out at everybody for whatever reason. Ramel Keaton had the second highest average per completion last year on this team. And in 2 seasons, Josh Heupel has had 6 different receivers with 450 plus yards receiving, which is bananas numbers. So I say all that to say this too, because I'm going to contradict myself. I know it's a great shock to everybody. But I talked when we first started talking about this topic. I said, "Can this team handle expectations?" Yeah, that's a concern, but the bigger concern is when you don't have expectations, right, Grant? And this is a program that spent a long time not really having expectations. I mean, maybe there was some hope, hey, maybe we can be a little better than we think. So there's a balancing act there of handling expectations and that being a quote concern about in your locker room versus a locker room that embraces the expectations because they believe that they're a good team because of what they've proven to themselves. I think Tennessee's kind of in that world right now, which is a pretty interesting place. Are they going to sort of step over, and turn those expectations into annual type things? Or are they going to say, well, we can't handle the pressure when everybody's talking about us? But I think you've got to have some expectations to have a chance to win. And I'm not sure this program's had enough of that the last few years.
And I think it's a kind of a rare time where the outside expectations probably kind of meet what the local expectations might be for this football team. Like, yeah, I think they're a top 25 team. I don't think they're a top 5 team. They're probably around that top 15, hovering in that area. I think it's right to have questions about or wondering what Joe Milton can give you and how consistently he can give you and what this offense looks like with Joe versus what it looks like with Hendon. It would be one thing if they were expected and being picked to win 10, 11 games and you didn't think that was going to happen, but it feels like there's kind of a mesh point where it feels like the expectations for this team to be a 8, 9, 10 win football team and kind of, I don't think this is a bridge year or anything like that, but you're kind of wondering what's next for this program after what Hendon Hooker did the last 2 years. So I think it's one of those times where it feels like the expectations are kind of right where they need to be. They're not too low. They're not too high. It feels like they're right there in the middle.
Yeah, I am a little surprised though, Matt, that the Joe Milton love, that they just the ascension that Joe Milton is a Heisman candidate. He's just going to, and look, Joe was terrific when he came in mop-up duty last year, and he played well against Clemson. I throw the Vanderbilt game out because they got a lead, and they said, look, throw it deep. If you complete it, great. If not, we'll punt it. No big deal. So I kind of throw that one away. But I am a little surprised at the national Joe Milton love. Not that he's not deserving of some hype and some expectations. I'm not saying that. But there's a lot of everybody jumping on the Joe Milton train this offseason based on him being the backup last year for Tennessee. I'm a little surprised by that outside noise nationally. Be curious to see how Joe handles that himself individually. That's different than team expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. That's a lot different than team expectations, and it's hard not to get caught up in that a lot of times. One of the things for me, I think, with Joe Milton, when he's getting that love, and not that he necessarily doesn't deserve that, but I think it goes back to something we said earlier. Maybe Eric said a little bit about blind faith in Josh Heupel putting up points. If he's going to be the guy, then I think the outside expectations from some of these national folks is that if he's going to be the guy under Josh Heupel, that it's just going to work. And it did work for 2 games. He like you said, he was excellent in mop-up duty. It worked against Vanderbilt. You can kind of throw that one out the window. And I thought Joe was good against Clemson. He was more decisive. Extended some plays. Had a couple of really good throws. The throw to Brew McCoy in the end zone was just one of the better throws you're going to see all year in all of college football. And I think if he's upright and able to stay in there, that's some of the stuff you'll see from him this year. Tennessee's going to attack the middle of the field more regularly with Joe Milton, and they're going to try to unlock his, potential with his arm. But again, there's just a lot there, that I think still left to be answered heading into this season.
I think it's a Heupel factor. I think it's a built like Cam Newton and throwing it 80 yards at the Peyton Manning Passing Academy factor. What I liked about Clemson specifically is there were times where he was holding on to the ball a little bit too long. He took a couple sacks or some 3-and-outs. It didn't look like the Tennessee offense that we had seen all season with Hendon Hooker running the show. And the way he responded to those, it didn't snowball and turn into something worse. The way he stepped into the pocket and threw those touchdowns to Squirrel and to Brew in traffic in the end zone, those darts. The way he hit Ramel Keaton, I mean, as open as Ramel Keaton was, it's pretty easy to get a little too excited and put that ball 5 yards past where it needs to be. But for him to just see Ramel and step up and throw it and put it right where he needs to be, I thought that was impressive. So I think it's a high pull factor. I think it's a size. I think it's an arm. I think it's what he did against Clemson on a pretty big stage on national TV, a New Year's Six bowl game. I think that's kind of the multiple factors where people are really kind of buying into what Joe can do this time around.
I mean, Clemson was without a couple of guys, but overall, top to bottom, top 3 defense you saw all year.
Yes.
So, I mean, Georgia, Alabama, and then Clemson. I mean, if you started talking about defenses heading into the season last fall, those were the ones that everybody had as a top 3. And, I think Clemson was still there at the end of the season. Maybe it was Miles Murphy that was out, but Brian Brzee played, and, Darnell Wright had a really good day against him. But overall, a very talented Clemson defense from top to bottom.
My question with Joe, and until we see it, I don't know what it's going to be, is his pocket presence, and we were discussing this on the board the other day in one of the threads, his pocket presence in terms of just sensing pressure and also just reading the defense and taking off and running and getting what he needs to get at certain times when he needs to get. I thought Hendon Hooker was really good at that, at just taking off with it when he needed to extend drives and to keep things going in the right direction. I want to see that from Joe and kind of how it looks compared to what it looked like in 2021 early in that year and what it looked like when he had the ball mop-up duty this past season.
You don't want this from a quarterback at all times, Grant. You tell me if I'm wrong. You don't want this from a quarterback at all times where, pre-snap Vince Young in the USC, national championship, I'm going to be the one that makes the play here. I'm getting to the corner. Right. But there are times when you need that, and Hendon Hooker did that. For me, with Joe Milton, you talked about him, bouncing back from some of those plays, being able to step up in the pocket and deliver. I think for him, that's the next step, is just continuing to ascend in confidence.
Right.
We saw it against Pitt. He struggled with some overthrows and never bounced back from holding the ball too long, in his first, season at Tennessee. He obviously progressed as the backup and looked good. Now, where does that confidence level go? It doesn't need to be too high, but there are times when he needs to say, I want the ball in my hands. I'm going to be the guy that makes the play here.
I think we're all excited to see what Joe Milton can be this year, leading the Tennessee offense, and if this offense can reach those expectations that, Josh Heupel's offenses have reached the past 5-6 years of play caller in this league and as a head coach.